hope you enjoyed that 1 hour of like information bombing. I mean, when I first watched that film, like it's 2 hours and 40 something minutes, I was like, yeah, okay. I need a deep breath before I can start like doing research on it and everything. So yeah, I'm really happy that we have Heather here, who's a poet herself and a researcher from the University of Dundee. And you want to introduce yourself, or?
It's alright. The film was so amazing at like managing to introduce and yet not introduce stuff in the way that it worked. I think let's just go with the same mode. Yeah.
Right, so how many of you have no idea about Taiwan? Like, never heard about it? Or, I mean,
Can't do a history lesson, but
yeah. So the ones, the people who know about Taiwan, how many of you know that we were colonized by Japan? There you go. Yeah. Right. So I assume, like, Heather, you want to talk about like when you first watched the film, you were surprised by the language and everything.
Yeah, I think that was our first conversation, wasn't it? It was. So I remember because you sent me this like. That's one of the like film festival packs, right? The screener link.
Yeah.
So I get the screener link and get to click on it, and then and it was just this like, because the film works so much with textures of language and with just texture in general, and then the moment the narration begins, it's Japanese, and for me that was like, even though I sort of have of all of the sort of Southeast Asian archipelagic kind of island and forces, there's quite like a distinctive timeline of colonization, re-colonization, which also exerts itself in like linguistic and particularly poetic linguistic forms, in some of that publication and all of those things. I was still shocked to hear Japanese in like the sonorous landscape was Japanese in relation to Taiwan rather than Hokkien or Mandarin, and it was that sort of like weird shocking into an historical moment, that I think we first talked about, because I basically said, oh shit. It's that weird thing that you know it and you don't know it, and of course then we talked a lot about a lot of those then publications which don't exist anymore, that demonstrate that sort of language texture as well.
Yeah, so I run through a lot of interview with the director. They show a lot of like literature journals, a lot of books about research about literature, and many of them actually doesn't exist anymore. The director just recreated from maybe a picture or something, image. But some of them in the film is actually a director gone through from different country, tried to collect them, and he actually found some of them. And even though the Moulin journal, like they were talking about issue 4, which is gone, disappeared. Nobody knows where issue 4 is. But luckily there is still issue 1 to 3 survives. So that's why, hence the film. So, well, I want to talk a bit about this collective themselves. So they were formed in 1933. They funded in 1933. It's a very short-lived. They only last for a year. And because the issue 4 was nobody knows even it's even been published or not. So people like historically people just say it like ended at 1934, and not long after the war began and everything. So Well, you just said like there was maybe issue 4 and then not long after the war began, but the fact that then the war begins, what happens is then even the previous issues, right, they become unnavigable, because you have up to this point this sort of language dynamic between sort of a written and spoken language, a sort of a political kind of
I don't know, like different levels of different sort of regional dialects being more or less legal. And then of course there's the war. And then as the film ends, which you haven't seen, but we can talk about, right? Because we have seen it. But as the film ends with the Chinese occupation, and which is maybe not surprising to those of you that know this history, at which point a different form of language ban comes in as well, which means that the kind of all of these publications, these sort of like artist publications, these ways of circulating poetry and art forms become differently legal and illegal, differently sort of political, partisan in various ways, in different ways, and so more or less dangerous. And I think one of the very cool things I found at the beginning of this is like immediately, and maybe it was my oh shit Japanese moment, but immediately there was that sense, and through this intense manipulation of the hand culture as well, of the danger of publication, which is something that I think we think less about now, or maybe are thinking more about now than we were maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah, so like the focus on the hand, I don't know, like it's quite obvious there's a lot of shots of the hand, and all the dialogues or people, they never show the face. I think in one of the director's interview he mentioned because these people are the ones that are forgotten by the history of literature, so like he tried to recreate the life of them, these people, but then he doesn't want, like, he wants to show that they are a group of people that doesn't have a face because they're forgotten. Yeah, that's one part of it.
And that's what the film does as well, yeah, because it introduces the names, and it has the group photos, and then it has specific poets, but at no point are they yoked to the quotations from the poetry which come in, which sort of articulate themselves with Western art forms translated through samizdat publications, or like and sort of grayscale images of Jishiriko into different sorts of aesthetic registers, right? And so you see the collective before you see individual poets, and then you see individual poets, and then there's a splintering of both the collective and the fact of the poetry, which is that the film sort of shows you that. And I found that really interesting because usually that's a sort of tragic narrative that could have been very easily taken up, I guess, by the director and just made, like, cashed in on, right? But there's a sense that there's a sort of the way that they put this together aesthetically, consciously, in relation to the way that poetic influence itself, cultural influence itself works. So you might see, I guess, a movie still of like Greta Garbo's face, or I don't know, looking at Greta Garbo's face, or sort of an excerpt from a poem by Stéphane Mallarmé, which the throw of the dice, by the way, comes into the film again and again and again and again, at various historical conjunctural moments. Or you get a sort of a snippet from a poem that almost becomes a slogan, but isn't a slogan because it's translated weirdly across cultures, right? And this way that influence works, like insidiously, is like particularly how this film works, and I found that really cool, really. And the sound editing as well. Like, I think that's something that we talked about.
The sound, I think the film is really long and it's quite experimental, even though there's dialogue and things, but like, I'm really surprised that like I said at the very beginning, I'm never a fan of experimental film. I was surprised that I really like it because I think the sound helps a lot. The sound design in it is just amazing. Yeah.
But the sound designer, right? So I didn't know this because, like, being a researcher, I'm really bad at doing my research. But the sound. So this is a film often that, like, French modernism and Spanish and Portuguese modernism and the effect of its circulation in a sort of a particular diasporic Southeast Asian context, right? And the sound designer is French and living in Taiwan.
Yeah.
So there's a sense that there's a particular texture in the sound design that resonates like weirdly non-conjuncturally, but like culturally specifically with the way that then happens in the film.
Yeah. So so I want to go back to the one that you talk about, like the language being banned and everything. So I just want to explain a bit of the background. So the main dominant language in the 30s, before, I mean, not in the 30s, but before Japanese occupation of Taiwan, is actually Hokkien, which is a branch of dialect from China. And when Japan first arrived, they didn't do any banning of language and everything, but the banning of language starts just before the war, because they want the people, local people, have more like identify themselves as Japanese instead of Taiwanese. That's also mentioned in the film that we're talking about, on writing Japanese instead of Chinese, and there is this debate between the realism writers, the left-wing writers, and this group of poems. So I think that's an interesting thing, because for them, like writing in Japanese, writing Taiwanese literature in Japanese, like they're seen as an outsider because they use Japanese. They are seen as you're not true to your own culture. But then when they're in Japan, like the Yeung, the main character, the first poet that they introduced, he studied in Japan, and he mentioned this woman is very particularly interested in him because he's from the south, from Taiwan, so he's also seen as an outsider when he's in Japan. So I think this is something that would be like happen during the colonization, when you're either. So yeah,
both and neither. But I think that's like speaking in the Scottish Poetry Library, right? There's a particular space that allows for that both and neither to also occur in a different suite of languages. But yeah, it's really interesting because you have, and I noticed again in that move, when there's that move to that kind of, in the film, this sort of the steam power and that sort of steam engine moment, where Japanese, because and this is the moment where it's useful to know that Hokkien has it's a 7-tonal language, Mandarin is a 5-tonal language, and Japanese doesn't have tones, so it's syllabic. But the film that is relating to that kind of intense, like rhythmic steam engine mechanical thing, means that Japanese syllabic language, which has no tones, is set up to just be that sort of Moraic charge, where everything, like a single, like every single unit of sound is the single unit of sound of the steam engine, and then you have that against the fact that the language that is happening before and afterwards is tonal, which the film sort of charts but doesn't tell you, right? It just shows you a little bit, or it shows you a little bit if you can read both the subtitles and like navigate all of the other language structures that are happening, which is also kind of an intense visual. But that and then in all of these reproduced pamphlets as well, you can see where there's tone and there's like that. So that's syllabitonic language, and then that Moraic language which doesn't have tone. Which the director and the sound editor put with the sounds of the toning of pages and the different quality of paper, which also relates quite profoundly to various imperial charges in the way that these circulations occur. So, like cotton rag paper sounds different to mulberry paper. Right? It feels different. It like and rice paper feels and sounds different, and all of that occurs in the sound editing for the film, which is again a signifier that relates to the language, because it's that language of the touch and the care and the circulation of these bits of poetry and writing and philosophy and images that are happening in this era. And I've totally diverged because I got obsessed with the steam engine thing. But that's,
yeah, well, you were talking about like bits of picture and poetry, and so like when I first watched the film, for this event I watched this film at least 4 times, and when I first watched the film, I find it like. I think the director, I assume the director is trying to recreate the whole timeline of the Poetry Society, but the only thing that's linear is the timeline. Everything else is just fragment, and but somehow you don't feel distracted, even though it's piece and like the sound, the poetry, the picture, everything is just bits and bits, but then you don't find it distracting. So yeah, I think that's what I find with all this.
Yeah, there's a real consistency in a way to this like non-distraction, but I got obsessed with the fact that blue kept coming in, right? In the images in the poetry, like the blue and the blue, like all the way through. There's that sort of, there are various symbols that have been retranslated. So they seem, so it's this sort of use of, for instance, surrealism or kind of any of these modes of modernism, which all come in together as like variant, like possible influences that then come in over and over again. Like at the moment I'm working on a project on stone that at least like a couple of people in this room are bored to death with already. But I found it really interesting. There's these Dishiriko images that come in over and over again that have obviously, because of print technology in the period, only been circulated in grayscale. In these prints. And then there's there's the colour images that give kind of a weird contextual context that blend into shots of parts of Taiwan that are in colour but take on that like weird pink light colour bleed that you get in Dishiriko. And so there's that odd way of looking at where you are through art and then looking back at where you are through art and then writing. That is some like this weird loop that the film is constantly sort of working through, which is very cool and at a weird it threads it together, but it also works against that just like incessant linear timeline where you know the war is going to happen at the end, or you should know the war is going to happen at the end. It's kind of that, you know, the moment that any painting or document comes up saying 1938, 1939, okay, I know the context of this film. But yeah, there's a subtlety to it, I think.
Yeah. Another thing I noticed in the film is the tables, like the desk or the dining table. They've been having this shot of the dinner of the poet. I mean, this is really, once again, I read a lot of interview with the director. So the director said he interviewed a family member of these poets because I think only one of them is still alive. Yeah, and so through the photos and diaries, letters, and any kind of clue he can find about these people, he even tried to recreate their dining table from maybe one day's diary, saying, "Oh, I have a fish and a miso soup today," and so that's a like really detailed part, and it also shows these people. They are seen in the literary circle at the time that they're strange, they are weirdos, but they are just like everyone else. They are having their homemade lunch, dinner, and everything. Any audience want to share any feedbacks? Because I assume this is your first time watching this film. It must be a lot to take in. Do you want to share, anyone? No?
Oh, there's too much to share. What am I gonna do? I saw that painting. I know the painting, and I have a question about the poem that came after, but I don't know what to do about the question about it. Yeah.
I was just to say that I was really interested to hear what you said about the way that class maps onto the language in the film, and I won't mangle the name of the Taiwanese like indigenous language, but versus the Japanese, and then also the way that they're kind of bringing in this kind of European modernism as a sort of signifier of an aspirational kind of art outside of Taiwan, and how class. I haven't seen the full film, but I'm kind of interested in the way the class figures onto these various literary groups that form. Yeah.
It's weird with Hokkien though.
Yeah.
Like, because it's not Taiwanese.
Sorry, excuse me.
Right. So yeah.
Well, I'll start. I think, just like I explained before Japanese occupation, actually Hokkien is the dominant language in Ireland. Well, of course there's indigenous people, but when you talk about literature, you talk about writers, they'll be the ones that are educated. And once Japan arrived, so during the Japanese occupation, the Taiwanese elite, they study in Japan. A lot of them study in Japan, and also there are schools that's for Japanese people and for Taiwanese people who are higher class. Like you say, there's a class division really. So, well, take my grandma as example. She's in her 80s. She's just right before the war, she was in this school in Taiwan, but it was taught in Japanese. But it's it's like a school for the common people. So there are actually, even the elementary school level, there is 2 different systems. Oh, yeah, wow. So the poets, these the Moulin, these members, they are, well, you can say they're elite, I think. And they mentioned the left-wing writers, the Yeung and like her. They are the more like grassroots, the grassroots Taiwanese. That's why they write in Chinese, and the things that write about is more about anti-colonialism and. For example, they mentioned The Paperboy by Yeung, which is a novel. It's basically describing how terrible Taiwanese people was treated during the colonization. Is there anything else you can say?
No. So I think that in any case, it's that like, and it's really interesting speaking here and sitting in front of Hugh McDermott. But this fact of any given, and I'm just going to claim like archipelagic island scenario under kind of a shifting sense of dominant rule operates inside and outside of language exchanges and language barriers, and how each of these change in their cultural resonance but hold on resonances from previous generations very quickly actually across this period in particular, like in area of Southeast Asia actually, but also because of that, those 2 dominant kind of imperial modes, which is the kind of the Meiji Dynasty, and then the way that Chinese communism rolls out across the diaspora. But then language becomes highly political, and language reform also is highly political, because it's a question of not letting one generation speak to the previous generation. And that's something that you also see in Turkey, right, with Kemet Musician, where New Turkish allows people to not speak to their Ottoman Turkish speaking and writing grandparents who write in a different script, who have a different language. So there's that sort of politics which feeds into the way that poetry is and is not circulated. So things that signify either a renegade culture or a leftist culture or a rightist culture in one, and when I say generation, I mean like even 3 years worth of a poetry society, right? In the next generation can be like absolutely the opposite, and we see that like at the end of the film, where a reading group might actually just sentence you to death under a new Chinese rule, right? So there is a strange literary language politics at play here, that a kind of a condensation and appropriation and use and transliteration and transumption of European modernism doesn't make better or worse. It's like, and Les Moulins are not, I guess, in like Taiwanese literary history, one of the dominant historical literary groupings, right? This is what this film is trying to do to recuperate this as well, which is this one moment, like this one conjuncture where like Proust comes in Samizdat, and like so this and in all of the sort of the book circulation culture that you see in the film. So is she pointing at the screen that doesn't show this? Like, on which we've seen those things like once. The book circulation culture is this like so the speed of there's two things coming in here. The speed of the film in the beginning 45 minutes or so, which we've seen, demonstrates this, like almost demonstrates formally the speed at which this like oh, but you didn't see that, you saw that, we share it, which in a digital age we sort of forget to appreciate that sort of like just the speed of how influence works, but also the way that figuration works. So you see the faces of all of these poets. And maybe if you're coming at it from one cultural perspective, you'll recognise them, but if you're coming from a different cultural perspective, you won't recognise either one series of faces of poets or the other series of faces of poets. And then the film allows you to put them together, but it doesn't allow you to put them together ever, because what it allows you to put together is the sense of the poetry, which is the kind of cool thing about taking this particular poetry collective, which isn't making a realist move, and it isn't making a folk lyric move, right? And it's not making a sort of an imperial move, which is what is also happening in literature at the time. And so then the film kind of works with that sensibility, I think.
Yeah. So I think I'm not sure if it was mentioned in the film the bits of the film that we just watched. I think Shi Yingping, the guy that they first introduced, he once in his letter to a close friend he did when the Poet Society was criticized by the rest of the literary circle, he did say like, I write poem, I write is not I think they did mention it, like I'm not a spokesman of the people. Like, I'm just writing it because that's what, like, I'm just writing the things that I'm interested in, and I don't know, but like for me, I'm suspecting it's a bit escapism. I mean, they never mention it, but I feel like these group of people, they also care about their country in their own way. I mean, yeah, what do you think is that?
There's an element of fantasy, right?
Yeah.
But also the way that if you sort of find a group of people that are aesthetically trying to push or break, like make a sister with how poetry order is working, often what you do is you kind of bring something in from somewhere totally different. So what I really liked about this film is how surrealism is made surreal, because the way that it's translated into a totally different sound world and image world. Like, so where, you know, a magnolia will mean something different, a balloon will mean something different. Like each of its core sort of images, a bridge will mean something different. Although bridges are kind of strangely similar. You have that sense, but also what I'm thinking, just looking at the time of the film, is that you have that sense of the shift in the way that print circulation happens, which is something that happens across this period, because whereas in alphabetic cultures there's a much more obvious kind of print and press culture. You see it when Le Moulin is being circulated, it's still the screen printing thing because of the characters, because for instance the typewriter, there's a long cultural history of this that I think published by University of Chicago Press, but I could be just like stereotyping University of Chicago Press. but of the kind of the evolution of the typewriter in Southeast Asia, where the like someone designed one, but then it just was like 5 years because it just didn't work. And then and so there's like a completely different mode in the same period of how modernism functions. So through the screen printing and through the sort of the character-based like block printing, like wood block printing, which for a long time has had like even like just basically a pre-digital culture that exists kind of for longer, bypassing the typewriter cultures that you get that influence alphabetic modernism. And you have that sort of, in the visuals of the film, you have that happening, which influences the poetry as well. But that's another aspect of the translation problem, right? The translation problem is sonorous in the paper and the languages. The translation problem is like literally to do with how can we make as many of this magazine as possible. Well, it's completely different from how we would make as many magazines as possible in an alphabetic mode of circulation.
Yeah. You've been like repeating the word translating. I mean, we talk about this a lot during our own conversation actually, because just back to what we talked about before, like the film is, the dialogues in Japanese and the filmmaker is Taiwanese, so the poem that the translation on the screen that you see is in traditional Mandarin, traditional Chinese, which is what we use in Taiwan, and then because it's a version for the foreign audience, so then you have the English subtitles, and some of the poems they even have the French on it. It's like, I mean, I don't know, like when I first watched it, I tried to look at all the blocks of text and I give up in the end. It's like, well, just read the one that like hit you the most. That'll make you understand everything easier in a way. But I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I mean, it's sort of a visually sort of deliberately designed that way, and that's also another kind of OCD part the director is showing. Well, once again, anyone in the audience want to share any feedback, or we should come to the conclusion?
No, I really like how esprit, like all of the loan words that you hear like into Japanese, right? It's like really interesting. So the things that are chosen, so there are various words that are important that then are just translated, and there are words that are transliterated, right? So you have that, and there's that like tension as well. So where a word has already become a symbol of something, as opposed to when a word can just be translated. And that was one of the kind of cool things as well that's happening across multiple languages actually in the film. But the most obvious one is when you see in the subtitles the inverted commas, and you hear like in Japanese a transliteration, and that maps onto just seeing the head of a poet and then hearing maybe an influence of the poet later on in the film or in the visual language of the film. So it's working on as many levels as, like, it's as there were problems in the period that is engaging with, which is to say it's very modern. No.
Yeah. Right. So, well,
how are we doing?
I think it's about time. I mean, yeah. So, thank you for coming. If you haven't finished your drink, welcome to just stay a bit. I mean, if they're not locking up, and we can just we can just chat a bit more if you're too shy to talk in front of the camera. Right. Thank you again, and hope you enjoyed the film. If you want to watch the whole film, it's still available on Moulin. Yeah. All right. Thanks.